Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Welcome to another AI Fundamentals AI Learning Byte. Today, we're going to be focused on generative AI challenges. So, some of the challenges that occur when we use generative AI. And a lot of these challenges are built around how Gen AI actually works. So, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Um, our lesson objectives for today, we're going to talk about how Gen AI works. We're going to talk a little bit about limitations of context limitations. We're going to talk about hallucination, bias, and drift. We're going to talk about cost, which is also very much a limitation. And then we're going to go through a little summary of what we actually learned in this lesson. Shouldn't take long. We'll be out of here in about 15 minutes. So, how Gen AI actually works. Generative AI produces responses by predicting what is likely to come next based on what it has learned in its foundation data. Now, remember, we talked about that foundation set of data, that foundation model on which Gen AI is kind of based. So, that foundation model has a set of information that the AI will know. Everything in there is what the AI knows. If it is not in there, the AI does not know. Okay. So if the AI was trained on, for example, Mary had a little lamb as a nursery rhyme, that would be in there, and the AI would know that lamb is what comes in this next section after little. And that's the way AI kind of generates answers essentially, or generates responses. It builds its response piece by piece based on what is expected or is likely to come next. Okay, it's not looking for the truth. It's not looking for, you know, the most accurate answer. It's generating the most likely answer. Okay. I want you to understand that it is not looking for the truth, it is looking for the most likely answer. Okay. That, or at least what is most likely to fulfill what you, as the person who's making the request or issuing the command, what you expect. All right. Are most likely to expect. Okay. Now, why does this cause challenges? This causes challenges, sorry, because generative AI knows only what essentially is in its foundation model. Now, you can add things to that, and we'll discuss that in ways of mitigating some of these challenges. But by and large, the way Gen AI works is that it knows what is in its foundation model. If something is not in its foundation model, it cannot predict what should come next when faced with information that exists outside of that foundation model. Okay, so it's hard for it to understand if it's not in its brain, so to speak, and we can consider the foundation model the brain of the Gen AI. If it's not in the brain, then it doesn't have an answer. So this causes it to sometimes misunderstand or mispredict um, its responses because it is still trying to answer, but it doesn't have the specific information that it needs. So if you ask Gen AI, or if you ask a foundation model, or you prompt, as what we call it, if you give the foundation model a command, and you say, oh, I want to find out information specific to my organization or your policies or your customers or, any of these things. And it is not within the foundation model, it cannot accurately answer. It will try to answer, but it cannot accurately answer. And that whole thing of trying to answer without having the relevant information or context leads to what is called hallucination. So it will produce an answer or it will produce a response, and it will be a confident response more likely than not. And it will have sources and maybe dates and statistics and names and policies and details. But the fact of the matter is, these things were not in its original foundation model. And so it kind of made something up that sounds like what would be a likely answer, even though it does not know the answer. Gen AI is a lot like, there are some persons, I'm sure we've all encountered them, who seem to be allergic to saying, I don't know. So Gen AI is a lot like that, or foundation models are a lot like that, in that if they don't know the answer or the information does not exist within the foundation model, they are still going to try to answer. And AI can therefore be wrong and confidently wrong. So what do you do with hallucination, or what do you do with AI responses or information that it generates? Always verify, important information, especially in business, legal, medical, financial, technical, or public facing work. If it's going to be something that can get you in trouble, in fact, even if it's not, always verify what AI generates for you. It's usually very good, usually sounds very convincing, but can actually be wrong if that information is not in its context or within the foundation model that AI is relying on. So that's one. The second thing is that foundation models are trained on a set of data, a set of information that you give it. That's how that's how foundation models are formed. Now, that data can be biased. That data can be biased towards um, a specific subset of the society, can be biased towards men, towards women, can be biased towards children, can be biased towards a specific race. It can be biased towards a specific country, or away from a specific country. Um, that bias influences the responses that the AI will give, because the model can only respond based on what is inside the model, inside the brain. If it is not in the brain, it cannot respond on it. And if the what is in the brain is biased, it will respond in a biased way. This causes issues with hiring and with lending and customer service and law enforcement and a whole set of other areas where bias can cause an inherent challenge. There are stories of entities that had Gen AI models, or that had models really, that actually were helping with their hiring decisions. Those models were biased against women, and therefore women were not hired by that company while that model had anything to say about it. That model has since been retired and that challenge has been alleviated, but that is a classic case of how bias can influence, some of these areas which are critical to us as human beings. It's and it, there is a suggestion given at the end here that AI outputs should be reviewed, especially where people may be treated differently or unfairly. You want people to be treated fairly. Now, the other challenge, or another challenge, is all around model drift. And this is kind of based on the fact that models, foundation models, are trained and created and then used. They are not perpetually trained. So you're not always training a foundation model. One version of a model is trained and it is then released to the public or put into whatever use case it was supposed to be built for, and it's used. All right. Um, the result of that is that as things change in real life, so as new political parties come into power, as you know, new companies are formed, as companies are disbanded, as um, other changes take place in life, as people die, as people are born, etc. As these things happen, what the model knows to be true eventually becomes no longer true because life has changed, because time has moved on. And therefore, what existed when the model was trained in 1994, in 2005, in 2024, in 2023, etc., what existed when these models were trained can be no longer true at this point in time. If a model was trained in 2020, COVID was very much a part of our lives back then. And the model would take into consideration COVID situations and COVID um, protections, etc. This may no longer be the case or may no longer be necessary, but the model doesn't know that. So that is called model drift, where the world changes and the model moves away. Well, the world moves away essentially from the truth that is in the model or what the model understands to be true. That's model drift. So you need to be monitoring and testing your models for drift with human review because we humans have the advantage of being up to date all the time. And then there's one other thing. I said models are not trained perpetually. Like you don't continue training a model every single day. You train a model once and then you release it and then you train the next model. Why is that? And here is the main reason. Cost. You see, models for training, require what are called graphical processing units. I think I mentioned this before, GPUs and CPUs, computing processing units. So graphical and compute processing units, both of them together, models require these for training, more GPUs than anything else. The GPUs require power, and it requires a lot of GPUs, require power and require cooling because the power and the use of the GPUs is going to generate heat, and you have to cool them so they don't catch fire. The training requires data. You need to take into consideration security and governance and skilled people who can make all of these cost areas a reality. You need to take all of this into consideration when training a model. And the result of that is that training models are very expensive. How expensive, you say? We're talking, between I think it's 70 million was the cost of one of the more recent models that were trained. And I think that's on the low side. It goes up to 100 million and upward from there. So 70 million is one of the larger models that were trained recently. That is a lot of money to train a model. And then the usage of the model then is also going to require power because the GPUs still need to work, and they're going to require cooling because you still need to cool them down. So model usage fees can tend to be quite high as well. Managing all of this for entities who produce models and who make them available to us is can be financially prohibitive, and they have to pass the cost on to us at some point in time. So we have to figure out, do we want to pay that cost? Do we want to pay the cost of training a model ourselves? Is it worth it to us? So we have to take cost into consideration. Today, we talked about how Gen AI works, how it predicts what's the next piece of information. That can be a token or a piece of a word. It can be a pixel or a set of pixels in an image. It can be a frame in a video. But what's the next piece of data? That's how it works. It doesn't know the correct answer. It's not looking for the truth. It just predicts what is likely to be next. Um, it doesn't automatically know your specific context unless you share that information. It can hallucinate because in trying to give you a response, it will sound confident, but even if it doesn't know, it is going to respond with something, and it's going to likely sound confident and have a whole set of information around that, and all of that can be very wrong. Um, we learned that models can amplify societal bias or can amplify bias in the training data. Models can drift away, or the world really can drift away from our models over time. And AI can be really expensive to build. These models are really expensive to train and to run. And therefore, you're going to want to have a solid human review process, some monitoring, and some good judgment in place to help you ensure that these models do not run you into trouble. That is the end of today's lesson. I thank you for your attention so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.